Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I'm your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. I also have to send out a huge shout out to Patreon supporter at the Rome level and friend Friedrich. Friedrich sent me 3 books from my Amazon wish list. 2 will be a big help for the upcoming 10th anniversary series, and 1 will help me get a little bit closer to finishing the Cambridge History of Christianity series, which I really greatly appreciate. Thank you so much, Friedrich. Speaking of Patreon, I want to send out a very special thanks to our newest patron at the Antioch level, SKR4T. Thank you so much for supporting the History of the Papacy on Patreon. Your support and people like you really are the ones who help keep this whole operation going, and I very much appreciate your support. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Yoren, William B., Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, Sarah, William H., and Judy at the Alexandria level. We have Dappo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Alex the Great, Amma the Great, Frederick the Great, and Jeffrey the Great. And with that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. I'd like to welcome today a special guest, Andrew Lucian, who's an author and podcaster at the Civil War Center, to talk about several really interesting topics of the 19th century. In today's episode, we're really going to be focusing on Nietzsche and the Catholic Church, and we might get into a couple of other issues, but this is a little bit outside of what Andrew talks about in the Civil War, but I think it's all going to tie together. Andrew, just to let the audience get to know you a little bit, well, first, how I found out about you is we're both in the American History Fanatics group, and then if people have listened to my podcast, I interviewed Andrew Hartman, a professor of history, on Karl Marx, which I actually learned from your podcast. I almost didn't want to interview him because you did such an awesome job interviewing him. I felt like I couldn't hold a candle to that. Maybe tell us a little bit about your podcast and then this whole write-up you did on Nietzsche, which was fascinating.
Yeah, so I do study the Civil War pretty intensively. That's kind of my main focus. I'm a middle school social studies teacher. I just switched from high school. So that's my day job. And then my night job is kind of what you mentioned. I run the Civil War Center podcast, blog, TikTok, Instagram, whatever, all that stuff. So I spent a fair amount of my time studying the American Civil War. But my other passion and thing I like to study is Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, who we'll talk about today as well, Carl Jung, a lot of the great thinkers of the 18th, 19th, 20th century, existentialism, nihilism. I find myself very drawn to these questions that they ask, and religion. Personally, I am a Christian, but I like to study the counter arguments of it, and I like to see what Nietzsche has to say, to see what the other options are out there, and that's something that I've been studying for quite a while now. I kind of got into it in a roundabout way, I guess. It was not something that was on my radar for a really long time. And I started looking into a lot of self-help stuff. And Dr. Jordan Peterson, who's pretty famous, very famous at this point, listening to his lectures and reading his books. And he would always talk about Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and Carl Jung. And I was like, I got to know more about them. Being a teacher who always wants to know more, I'm like, I can't just listen to this and not understand. So I began studying these guys a little more in depth, reading some of their works. And the one specifically that you took interest in was Nietzsche's God is Dead, which is an excerpt from The Gay Science, a book that he wrote. And I know we're going to dig into that a bit today. But that's kind of my background and how I got into Nietzsche and this existentialism and nihilism, all these things we'll talk about.
Yeah, I think we're going to really learn. And what I learned from your post and doing some other reading into it is that he's a really complicated guy. And it's not just like saying God is dead is not just a flat statement. It's completely filled with so much meaning. Mm-hmm. Maybe talk a little bit about who Nietzsche was, Friedrich Nietzsche.
Yeah, so Nietzsche was born in Saxony in 1844, and believe it or not, his father was a priest, which is kind of ironic given where he goes. His father does pass away when he's young, so he grows up without a father figure, which definitely is going to influence him and influence some of his critiques of Christianity and this idea of a heavenly father. He does grow up surrounded by the church. And he's on a path to follow in his father's priestly footsteps until he comes across a book called The Essence of Christianity. And this book's going to completely do a 180 in his life. He's going to change from following in the priesthood and this path that he's taking for Christianity and the church, and he's going to completely turn to an atheistic, nihilistic more mindset. He's going to actually become a professor at the age of 24, which was unheard of. He was incredibly intelligent, obviously. He does that for several years, but he has health problems. Like I said, his father died young, and they're not totally sure today what he died of, but it appears that Nietzsche inherited whatever the illness was or some form of illness. So he steps away from being a professor and he begins to write. He can't write very much at a time because he doesn't have the health for it. So he'll write about a paragraph or two at a time. And if you read Nietzsche's work, it's very, very dense. And he made a very arrogant statement where he said he could write something along the lines of he could write in a few sentences what someone couldn't even write in an entire book, which is it's a good flex, I guess. So he's very intelligent, very gifted writer, but part of that's because he's ill and he's unable to write for long periods at a time. So when he sits down to write, he's going to make sure what he's saying is what he wants to say and his point's coming across. He writes a lot of books, The Gay Science, which is where he declares God is dead in 1882. He writes Beyond Good and Evil, which is another one of his masterpieces where he critiques philosophy, Christianity. Several books, and then he eventually, for the last about 11 years of his life, last several years of his life, he actually goes mad, and he's basically mentally incapacitated until he passes away in 1900. Friedrich Nietzsche's works were not widely read in his lifetime. Beyond Good and Evil, I believe, sold about 500 copies while he was still alive. So he was more writing for himself without any idea if an audience was going to pick up on it, which they do. And after his death, his ideas are really widely spread and established. And part of that is because at that time, and still to this day, we're grappling with nihilism, this idea of what happens, how do we create a value system? What's the point of life? And if there is no value system and there is no point in life, then, oh well, it's a very daunting existential void to stare into. And Nietzsche loved to stare into that void. And he formulates some of his own ideas for how to deal with that void. But his works are all grappling with existentialism, nihilism, what's man's purpose in this world, what's it all worth, how do we create a value system? And his answer is not Christianity. It is not the church whatsoever. He's very opposed to that.
Was he a particular, what Christian denomination? Was he a Catholic, a Lutheran?
I'm not sure of the denomination. That's a good question. But I do know he grew up surrounded by it. And he was very much into it in his youth.
It's kind of interesting, the time period that he grew up with in German unification. And there's a lot of stuff going on at this time period.
Yeah. And, Nietzsche doesn't think the state or Christianity or a higher power is what's going to fill that void. And it's hard to imagine that uncertainty of government and the revolutions and the things that are going on, as well as the death of his father, that these things don't impact his ideology and his idea of the Übermensch, which we'll get to. But yeah, it's hard to imagine at the time he's brought up in, and the turmoil does not have an impact on where his thinking and his thought process goes.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors. So he writes this book, The Gay Science. I guess coming at it from your perspective, do you get a vibe that I'm talking like the kids now? Do you get a vibe of where he was coming from as far as like all these different ideas that were floating around? Marx comes up not too far from where he's from. Like he's in this whole like German high-end philosophical area. Did he fit in with any of these schools?
Nietzsche's work is catered to that crowd. So in The Gay Science and in Beyond Good and Evil, and in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is another phenomenal work of Nietzsche's. If anyone's gets the opportunity to read it, I highly suggest reading that one as well. It's actually interesting. I'll get off topic for a second. Carl Jung, the great psychoanalyst, he actually has a whole lecture series he did on Thus Spoke Zarathustra and the imagery in that book. It's a beautiful, beautiful work. It's full of archetypal imagery, symbolism. But in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he presents the idea of the Übermensch, or this great man that transcends religion and transcends culture and society and what's been placed on us, and creates his own value system. And he sees the Übermensch as artists, philosophers, writers, this crowd that he's around and that he's writing for, like Marx and these great thinkers. So he sees them as almost like a superior human who can take humanity in a new direction. So he's definitely influenced by those philosophers of the time, and that's who he's writing to. And I mentioned Dostoevsky. He's very much the opposite. He deals with the same ideas that Nietzsche deals with. How do we create value system? Existentialism, nihilism. What's the point of life? Man, how do we create value system? How do we create living value in our life? What's the point of being alive? But Dostoevsky is writing for the poor. He's from Russia. He's from a very poor background. Obviously, the peasantry in Russia, incredibly poor and destitute. And so Dostoevsky formulates a different idea, and he comes at it from a different perspective. So he's much more of a common man's philosopher, even though he was a fiction writer, he really is a philosopher in a sense, where Nietzsche is definitely catering to the higher upper class, intellectual, elite artist, and he sees them as the solution to nihilism, as these superior humans who can create works of art and literature and ideologies that can transcend religion, that can transcend our social norms, our social constraints. So he's very, very much lifts those kind of people up on a pedestal.
In the gay science, I think that's one thing that's really fascinating about Nietzsche is that people know God is dead. People know the Übermensch. Say most people probably couldn't say that the one came from the gay science and the other one came from the book Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And I think that they probably don't know, most people wouldn't know the kind of the context of those. Can you maybe break down this God is dead? Because it comes, like you said, if he can write more in a sentence than most people can write in a book. Let's unpack that,
Yeah,
that statement.
he's proud of that. Well, so yeah, that's a great point you make. So people love, it's kind of like the old joke. You go into a bathroom stall and you see graffiti and it says God is dead, Nietzsche. And then the next quote says Nietzsche is dead, God, right?
Yeah.
It's just like a famous cultural almost phenomenon that's taken place from this one line of a book that most people don't know the book. They don't know Nietzsche. They don't know the ideology behind it. And it's become sort of a banner of anti-religion is, well, God is dead. So what is Nietzsche saying in God is Dead? So the line actually comes from a portion of the book that's a story. It's not Nietzsche talking. The first half of this section of God is Dead is a critique of Christianity. In the second half, he starts to he declares God is dead and kind of talk about what that means and signifies. And so the line comes from a character. A madman is what he's called, and he's in a marketplace and he's running around looking for God, and everyone there is like, well, you look at this guy, he's crazy, he's crying out, he's looking for God. And the madman makes this big claim where I have it here. I'll read the passage for the listeners where it says, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we console ourselves, the most murderous of all murderers, the holiest and the mightiest that the world has hitherto possessed, has bled to death under our knife. Who will wipe away the blood from us? With what water could we cleanse ourselves? So Nietzsche's not making this proud announcement of, oh, God's dead, no more religion, no more Christianity, do what you want. That's not what Nietzsche's doing here. He's taking on this statement holds a lot of weight and a lot of significance. And it's the idea that as we have moved through the Enlightenment and we've turned to rationality and reason in the Western world, he's critiquing that and saying we've replaced God with reason, with rationality. And if we think as men, we are so highly evolved and capable of replacing God, who do we think we are? How will we replace him? How will we ever create a value system without falling into nihilism, without falling into despair? And if there's no God and no morality, how do we say what's right or wrong? So Nietzsche here is not, I can't stress enough, he's not proudly saying God is dead. He's critiquing the Western world and the idea that we've replaced God with rationality and with reason. And if we replace God with rationality and reason, will the bottom fall out? And will the Western world fall apart? How will we create a value system? How will we keep society going? Whether or not you believe in the biblical text and the biblical narrative, it's very difficult to argue that Western society has not been fundamentally based in the religious text and the Christian and the Judeo-Christian tradition. So if we're going to remove that and God is dead now, how will we move forward? And that's really what Nietzsche is bringing forth here in the gay science. That's the idea that he's arguing.
So what he's not making this anti-religious, atheistic, what you might call manifesto. He's really laying out a statement of facts in a way.
Yes.
That this is religion isn't the thing that's that our society is based around. Now what?
Yeah, it's like you said, he's in this time of these great thinkers and challenging our whole social structure. Karl Marx, he's challenging the Western world entirely the system that the Western world is based on, and saying, is this the correct way to govern? Is this the correct way to distribute wealth for people to live? So the foundation of the Western world is being shaken at this point, and Nietzsche's stepping in and saying, what are we going to do now? Now, that's not to say he liked Christianity, which he clearly does not. He has some great quotes about nihilism and Christianity, and he believed that Christianity sort of killed itself. He thought that the search for truth became so ultimate that it actually created a dogmatic Christianity and kind of killed itself. And thus, God is dead. And so replacing God with rationality and reason, does that hold water? Can that be the case? And if so, if man can create his own value system, how does man do that? And again, that goes back to the Übermensch. So that is what he puts forth in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Such a beautiful piece of work. It really is. But that's where he creates the idea of the Übermensch, that this man can go back to a de-evolved state, to a state of primitiveness, almost like an Adam and Eve state. And can he create his own value system that's not based around God, that's not based around religion? Is that possible? And to be honest, we're not really sure. You could, argue that we're still waiting to see if those answers play out. Now, personally, I would argue that they don't. And I would say the answers to that lie in the 20th century and the atrocities of the 20th century. So as we see in the Enlightenment, the 15th, 16th, 1700s, we're moving through this. We're shifting away from religion. We're replacing God with rationality and reason. Nietzsche's declaring God's dead in the 19th century. And I think the 20th century really shows us the fruits of that ideology.
I think that it's these thinkers like Marx and Nietzsche and so many of the other ones in that time period. I think maybe people today, and push back on this if you think, people today want answers. They want policy prescriptions and utilitarianism, and they don't think about that. The philosophical framework is more important than saying X, Y, and Z. We have to do this and this to feed the poor, and to that. If we don't understand ourselves philosophically and who we really are, we can't go forward. And people like Dostoevsky and all these people you're speaking about, they really were concerned with that.
Yeah, they really wanted to answer the question of nihilism. They were not content sitting around. And something I think that's become more popular is if you ask someone, do you believe in God, or what do you think happens when you die? And they might answer, I don't know. And then you say, well, doesn't that bother you? No. Well, if you ask Nietzsche or Dostoevsky that, it would bother them. And I think that comes through in their work, because it seems like in their writings, they're wrestling with their own thought process, and they're trying to formulate a thought. And I think that's the dance of philosophy, is I'm going to throw a thought out there and I'm going to see if I can weave this together, and you might get it and you might not. But Nietzsche and Dostoevsky definitely do a good job in formulating those thoughts and opinions. But yes, they're very, very concerned with this idea of nihilism. I have a couple more passages from Nietzsche where he talks about nihilism, and he says, of what is great, one must either be silent or speak with greatness. With greatness, that means cynically and with innocence. What I relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. I describe what is coming, what can no longer come differently, the advent of nihilism. So he sees that nihilism is inescapable with the death of God, with the replacement of the church and Christianity with rationality and reason. But he sees that as a problem. So again, that goes back to him not proudly declaring that God is dead. He's saying God is dead, so we have to do something. We can't leave this massive void in the world. Kind of contrary to Marx in a way, right? Because Marx says it's the opiate of the masses and you don't need religion, but we see how that works out. And Nietzsche predicts it here. He says, I describe what is coming. What I relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. So when we take God away, we see atrocities like the gulags and what happened in the Soviet Union under Stalin. Just mass atrocities of people being thrown in prison, people being starved to death. We see the concentration camps, right? So Nietzsche's not content to sit there without an answer. He can't sit there and say, God is dead, so what now? Like, we don't need anything. He's not happy to arrive at that point. He wants to answer that question. He goes on, he says, our whole Europe culture is moving from some time now with a tortured tension that is growing from decade to decade as toward a catastrophe, restless, violently, headlong, like a river that wants to reach the end, that no longer reflects, that is afraid to reflect. He that speaks here has, conversely, done nothing so far to reflect. As a philosopher and solitary by instinct who has found his advantage in standing aside outside. So he sees Europe heading down this terrible path. And he steps in to try to fill that void of nihilism. But again, he does not think Christianity is the answer. And he's still very concerned though with Christianity being gone. So it's interesting. He doesn't like Christianity on the one hand, but he's very concerned that it's gone and this big void that it leaves.
What in practical sense is nihilism? How would we define nihilism?
Yeah, nihilism is this idea kind of out there, but when you remove value system and structure and meaning from someone's life, you sort of fall into this void of what matters. A good example of nihilism is in Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. So in Crime and Punishment, the main character, Raskolnikov, he commits murder and he gets away with it, scot-free. No one catches him, sort of by chance. He doesn't even plan it out that way. He's not a mastermind criminal. He really lucks out. And he's sort of a nihilistic, narcissistic, to an extent, character who he has no value system. He has no faith, no religion. He just goes by the whims of his own desires. And he falls into this dark void of whatever goes, because there's nothing. There's no God. There's no religion. There's no morals. So nihilism is this void that you can fall into rather quickly if you give humans nothing to guide them, no morality, no faith, no even in Nietzsche's case, it would be the Übermensch. Even if there is no Übermensch, it's this idea of God is dead and we're not going to replace it with anything. That's basically what nihilism comes down to.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. And that's really bad news. If you don't like in Crime and Punishment, this guy who has nothing and he just goes into like total downward spiral. What does Nietzsche think that we can plug in to the gap to fill this void so that we don't fall into nihilism?
So Nietzsche, as I said earlier, he writes for the upper class. He's writing for artists, poets. He thinks power, self accolades, achievements, making oneself great is what gives a meaning to life. Seeking basically your own goodwill. He thinks that being great is what fills the void. So we don't need a greater being than us to make us great. We create ourselves and make ourselves great. And that's the idea of the Übermensch, of throwing off the constraints of society, the constraints of religion, as Nietzsche would view it, and seeking power, seeking riches in this world, right? It's very contrary to a biblical narrative of storing riches in heaven and not on the earth. And Nietzsche's very much not just seeking pleasure necessarily. I don't want to paint him in that light, that it's just pleasure, because pleasure can be found easily and cheaply. Nietzsche's idea is to find power and to find achievements in doing great things, creating great works of literature, great philosophies, great ideas. So it's different than just the cheap pleasure of going out there and doing whatever you want.
So it's kind of like the goal-oriented life that you set yourself goals. And it's kind of more, it's not the Übermensch is maybe something, it's not a person. It could be people to look up to, but it's kind of trying to find the Übermensch in yourself.
Hmm. Yeah, it's really both. You have Ubermensch that you can look up to who do create new meaning for society. But yes, you can also find it within yourself and finding greatness. And this is again all contrary to Dostoevsky. So he's coming from poverty, from Russia, from a very different situation. And for him, his answer, he was an Orthodox Christian, so his answer is God. So we see it very much in Crime and Punishment, where Raskolnikov gets away with the crime. He murders two people actually, and he gets away with it. But does he really get away with it? Because something in him is still gnawing away at him, even though he has no belief system, no faith. He's very nihilistic, very narcissistic, and so what Dostoevsky, on the contrary to Nietzsche, is arguing is that we cannot create our own value system, that we are incapable, and that almost in a sense we're innately designed with senses of morality within us that can't whimsically be created by an Ubermensch, that can't be created on a person-to-person basis, that we have a value system greater than us. And that's what really holds Raskolnikov responsible for his actions, because he does get away with it in the eyes of man. And from a Nietzschean perspective, if you get away with something in man's eyes, well, you got away with it. But from Dostoevsky's perspective, he doesn't get away with it because he doesn't get away with it in the eyes of God. So they're really yin and yang to each other, where Nietzsche's much more man-centered and Dostoevsky's much more God-centered, but they're dealing with the same issues of nihilism. Nietzsche's saying, God is dead, man, turn to yourself, where Dostoevsky's saying, God is dead, we need to turn back to God.
It's interesting, though, that like Raskolnikov, if he finds it in his own self that he's fine with having offed two people, then it really, according to Nietzsche, wouldn't that be fine then, as long as he's able to move past that? Has he descended into nihilism?
Yeah, to an extent, he really has. Raskolnikov definitely descends into a nihilism. But to Dostoevsky, it's a problem to Nietzsche as well. But to Dostoevsky, whether your answer is to just fall into nihilism or your answer is to fall into nihilism and then look into yourself and make yourself an Ubermensch, that's not going to work. So Dostoevsky doesn't see either of those as viable options. And it is important to note Dostoevsky's background and his upbringing is much different. He sees the poverty and the atrocities of Russia and the struggles of the peasantry therein, where Nietzsche, he's a professor at the age of 24. He grows up around the priesthood. He's coming from more wealth than Dostoevsky. So again, it comes back to that idea that it's comes back to the biblical idea in the New Testament, where Jesus says it's harder for a rich man to enter heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. And Nietzsche is talking to those rich people who feel like they don't need God, right? If you've had a good life your whole life, you don't need anything beyond yourself. You feel like you can go inward. You can create your own value system. You can be an Ubermensch. Where from Dostoevsky's perspective, when you come from poverty and you feel like you need external help, you want to reach out to a higher power to help you, or to have something to look forward to in the next life, because maybe your life here isn't so great. So I think those backgrounds really do shape their perspective, and they also shape who their audience is.
You can kind of see the difference between individual and corporate. I mean, it's salvation in a way that, can you save yourself, or do you need others? Do you need the church? And you can see how the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church and probably most churches would have a big problem with saying that you by yourself can do everything and you don't need anything else to find your own meaning in life, salvation, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, again, I think the 20th century is just chock full of examples of why Nietzschean ideas don't work, why man can't create your own value system. Because if you look at these societies, Russia, Maoist China, Nazi Germany, and you look at communistic states as well, Soviet Union being one. When we want to replace God, like Karl Marx did, he wants to get rid of the church, right? It's the opiate of the masses. We don't need it. It just suppresses people. Okay, well, if we're suppressing people with religion, then it would follow, like Nietzsche thought, that man could, if he's free from religion, which is suppressing him, then he can live to his fullest potential. He can create his own value system, and he can create the best life possible. But when we look at societies where they do throw off Christianity, religion, the Judeo-Christian tradition that the Western world's based on, we see horrible, horrible atrocities. Again, like I said, gulags and concentration camps and intentional mass starvation, executions, just, things like of nightmares, right? So yeah, I agree. I think the church would argue against the idea that man can create his own value system. Because when you do so, when you remove the church, what's going to take the place? And in those countries in the 20th century, we see that people are very willing to allow, and it's very important that people realize that they allow evil to come to power. People, I think they think that Stalin and Hitler, if I was in Nazi Germany, I would have never let them come to power. That's what people like to say. If I was in the American South, I wouldn't have, been involved in slavery. But this is an idea that Jung put forward, is the idea of the shadow. And it's very important that people understand their capacity for evil in order to do good. And that's something that Jung believed in greatly, is that if you don't realize your great, great capacity to do wrong, you will never be able to reach your full potential in doing good. And you have to integrate those two. It's the Taoist idea, or the Taoist idea of yin and yang, that life is found somewhere in the middle. Between chaos and order, good and evil, masculine and feminine. These are Jungian ideas. But I think that man has to understand that they're capable of doing these horrible things, of being a soldier in a concentration camp or a soldier at a gulag, in order to help better guide and shape society. And it's important for man to realize that when he takes away the value structures that have guided us for so long, and try to create his own value structure, these are the things that inevitably happen. These people inevitably take power, because we're all capable of such great evil. Whether you acknowledge it or not, we are. And I think history is just chock full of examples of that. People always say the modern day is so bad. I'm like, well, read a history book, and we can find a lot worse examples of things. But that's the danger of taking God out. If God is dead, and he remains dead, if we try to replace it with our own value system, or we try to replace it with the state, we see that inevitably these psychopathic ideologues come to power, and they impose their will on the rest of society. And because man has this shadow and this great capacity for evil, we usually go along with it.